My name is Lauren Walker. I'm 37 years old, and until last summer, I thought I finally understood where I stood in my family. I found out I was wrong the day my phone rang, and the first words I heard were, "Something happened at your cabin." I had spent 11 years working, saving, and keeping my head down to buy that place. I didn't tell anyone. Not because I wanted to be secretive, but because I wanted one thing in my life that couldn't be claimed, shared, or explained away with were family. That illusion lasted exactly one holiday weekend. While I was hours away, my parents showed up at my cabin with about 30 relatives. They didn't ask. They didn't call. They treated it like a family property, turned it into a 4th of July party. And by the time I understood what was happening, the situation had already spiraled out of control. When I got that call, my mother wasn't apologizing. She was panicking. Not about crossing a line, but about the mess they couldn't undo. That was the moment something in me snapped. Not anger. Clarity. I realized this wasn't about a cabin. It was about boundaries my family had never respected, and the assumption that anything I built was still theirs to use. I didn't know yet how far this would go. I didn't know how badly it would fracture everything. I only knew that whatever happened next would change my family forever. Before I go any further, if stories about family betrayal, boundaries, and real consequences keep you watching, make sure you're subscribed. These stories take time to tell, and your support helps us bring more of them to the channel. Now let me tell you how everything unraveled. A long time before the cabin ever existed, my place in my family had already been decided. I grew up in a household where control passed for concern, and favoritism was dressed up as practicality, and from the outside, everything looked stable, responsible, and normal. Inside, the rules were clear. My parents managed every decision, every milestone, every expectation, and they did it with a confidence that left no room for questions. My older siblings were treated as long-term investments. Their education was planned early, discussed openly at the dinner table, and fully supported without hesitation. Tuition checks were written without resentment. Rent was covered when needed. Cars appeared at the right time. When they stumbled, my parents called it helping them get back on track. When I watched from the side, it was always explained as fairness, as common sense, as doing what made the most sense for the family. My role was different. I was the one who was told I was strong, capable, and independent, which sounded like praise until it became the reason no one ever stepped in. When college decisions came up, the conversation ended quickly. I was told to choose something practical and figure it out. When I worked 2 jobs to cover my own expenses, my parents framed it as character building. When I struggled, they reminded me that I had always been good at handling things on my own. Their tone shifted depending on who they were speaking to. With my siblings, their voices softened, questions were asked, and mistakes were explained away. With me, conversations were direct, clipped, and final. "You'll manage. You don't need help. You've always been fine." Over time, I stopped bringing up plans, stopped sharing ideas, stopped mentioning goals that mattered to me. It wasn't worth watching interest fade the moment the conversation moved away from my siblings. Family gatherings reinforced the pattern. Achievements that weren't mine were celebrated loudly, repeated often, and retold like proof that everything my parents had invested in was paying off. When I mentioned my own progress, it was acknowledged politely and then brushed aside. The message was subtle but consistent. What I built for myself didn't need attention because it didn't require their involvement. That difference shaped how I thought and how I planned. I learned not to expect support, not to ask for permission, and not to rely on approval that never came. I made decisions quietly and paid for them the same way. By the time the idea of buying something of my own entered my mind, I already knew it wouldn't be shared, discussed, or celebrated. It would simply exist separate from family conversations and expectations. That distance wasn't accidental. It was learned. It came from years of watching help flow in one direction while responsibility flowed in another, and understanding that in my family, independence wasn't admired, it was assumed. It started quietly without announcements or celebrations. I bought the cabin at a point in my life when I had learned to move without asking for permission and to make decisions without inviting commentary. The place sat several hours away from where my family lived, far enough that it wasn't convenient to drop by, tucked into a stretch of land that felt deliberately separate from the routines I had spent years navigating. I didn't buy it as a getaway for anyone else, and I didn't imagine it as a future gathering spot. It was meant to be somewhere I could rest, reset, and exist without negotiating space or explaining why I needed it. That intention mattered more than the structure itself. The decision not to tell my family came easily because it followed a pattern I had already lived with for years. Boundaries in my family were treated like temporary inconveniences rather than limits that needed to be respected, and anything owned by one person was eventually reframed as something that should benefit everyone. I had watched plans become expectations and personal choices turn into shared obligations, often enough to know how this would play out if I said anything too early. Keeping the cabin to myself wasn't secrecy for the sake of hiding, it was a way of protecting something before it could be claimed. I told one person outside my family, someone who had no interest in inserting themselves or passing the information along, because handling everything entirely alone felt unnecessary, but involving family felt risky. That choice reinforced what the cabin represented to me. It wasn't about status or proving anything to anyone else. It was about ownership in the most basic sense, having a place that didn't come with assumptions attached. Every detail, from how it was used to when it was visited, was decided without negotiation. That freedom was unfamiliar and grounding at the same time. I paid for it with my own savings, handled the paperwork quietly, and treated it as something that existed alongside my life rather than at the center of it. I didn't post about it, didn't mention it in passing, and didn't frame it as a milestone. Experience had taught me that once something was labeled important, it became available for commentary and access. By keeping it unspoken, I kept it intact. The cabin became a physical boundary that reflected the mental ones I had learned to build. It stood for control over my own time, my own resources, and my own decisions, none of which had ever been fully respected before. That sense of separation was intentional. I wasn't trying to exclude anyone out of spite or resentment. I was choosing not to repeat a cycle where anything I built was treated as communal by default. The distance gave me space to think clearly, to enjoy something without anticipating interference, and to exist without preparing defenses in advance. At that point, there was no conflict attached to it, no argument waiting to happen, and no reason for anyone else to be involved. It was simply mine, and for once, that felt uncomplicated. The 4th of July arrived without warning, like most turning points do. I wasn't at the cabin that weekend, and there was nothing about the day that suggested it would become anything more than another holiday I spent elsewhere, unaware of what was unfolding hours away. My family didn't see my absence as a reason to pause or ask questions. Instead, they treated it as an open invitation. Without checking with me, they drove out with roughly 30 relatives' cars filling the driveway and spilling onto the surrounding road. Coolers, unloaded food brought in, music turned up. In their minds, there was no boundary to cross because they didn't believe one existed. The cabin wasn't framed as something personal or private. It was talked about as a shared space, something that belonged to the family simply because I was part of it. The logic was familiar. Family means access. Family means use. Family means no one has to ask. What followed was exactly what happens when entitlement replaces permission. The cabin was turned into a gathering spot, loud and crowded, the quiet purpose it was meant to serve erased within hours. People moved through it freely, rearranging things without hesitation, using what they found, without checking, treating the space like it had always been theirs. The atmosphere shifted from casual to careless as the day went on, and no one slowed things down. The noise, the drinking, the assumption that nothing could go wrong, all fed into the same pattern I had seen my entire life, where limits were dismissed as unnecessary and consequences were someone else's problem. The incident itself didn't happen in isolation. It was the result of too many people treating a place they didn't own like it didn't require care. Something went wrong during the gathering, and by the time anyone reacted, there was already damage. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was serious enough that it couldn't be ignored or undone. Smoke, heat, and poor judgment left marks that wouldn't fade with a quick cleanup. That was when my phone rang. My mother's voice was frantic, layered with urgency and fear, but not with regret. She spoke as if the problem wasn't that they had come without permission, but that things had gotten out of hand. The way she described it made it clear she still saw the cabin as something we all shared responsibility for, something that belonged to the family rather than to me. There was no acknowledgement that they shouldn't have been there in the first place, no hesitation about why they felt entitled to use it. The focus stayed on the situation they needed help fixing, not on how they created it. As she talked, details slipped through that confirmed what I already suspected. They hadn't seen their presence as temporary or conditional. They had settled in, made themselves comfortable, and acted as though the space existed for moments exactly like this. The panic in her voice wasn't about crossing a line, it was about the fallout. Listening to her, I understood that from their perspective, this wasn't a violation. It was an inconvenience. The cabin had been absorbed into the same family dynamic that had always minimized my ownership and overstated their access. By the time the call ended, the reality was unavoidable. The cabin had been taken over without my consent, treated like communal property, and damaged as a result. What happened that day wasn't an accident in isolation. It was the predictable outcome of a belief my family had never questioned. I returned to the cabin the next day. What I saw didn't feel dramatic in the way people imagine damage does, but it was unmistakable. There were scorched areas where heat had traveled farther than anyone expected, soot where smoke had settled and stayed, and signs of careless use that couldn't be brushed off as nothing. Furniture was out of place. Surfaces were stained, and the quiet order I had built was gone. I didn't stand there counting losses or replaying worst-case scenarios. I felt a tight, steady awareness that something fundamental had been violated. My parents and siblings were already there, moving around as if they belonged, talking over each other, explaining before I had asked a single question. When I confronted them, the responses came fast and familiar. It was framed as an accident, as something that could have happened to anyone, as an overreaction on my part. I was told it wasn't a big deal that these things happen, that focusing on damage missed the point of being together. The phrase "family doesn't keep score" was used like a shield, followed closely by reminders that I was taking things too seriously. Every explanation minimized what they had done, while quietly shifting responsibility onto me for reacting at all. I waited for someone to say they were sorry in a way that acknowledged the boundary they had crossed, but that moment never arrived. What I heard instead were apologies that came with conditions, regret aimed at the inconvenience, rather than the choice to show up uninvited. The conversation kept circling the same justifications, none of which addressed the core issue. They talked about intentions, about how no one meant for anything to happen, about how my reaction was making the situation worse. Each sentence was another attempt to redefine the problem as my inability to move on, rather than their decision to act without consent. As the discussion dragged on, it became clear that no one was actually listening to what I was saying. They weren't acknowledging that the cabin wasn't a shared space, or that permission mattered. They weren't recognizing that treating my property as communal wasn't an accident, it was a choice rooted in years of entitlement. The gaslighting wasn't loud or aggressive. It was calm, persistent, and confident, delivered with the assumption that I would eventually back down to keep the peace. I was told I was being dramatic, that I was creating conflict where there didn't need to be any, that I was risking relationships over something that could be fixed. What struck me most was how quickly concern for me disappeared once I didn't agree. Their focus stayed on restoring normalcy, not on accountability. Standing there, I understood that this wasn't a misunderstanding that could be resolved with clearer communication. It was the result of a long pattern where my boundaries had never been taken seriously because they were inconvenient. The realization settled without anger. There was a finality to it. No one was prepared to admit they had crossed a line, and no one was willing to accept limits that challenged their access. At that point, the argument stopped being about damage or repairs. It became about whether I would continue to accept being minimized to preserve a version of family harmony that had never included me as an equal. The answer was already clear. The tension didn't fade after the argument ended. It settled into the space like something heavy and unmoving. No one left. Conversations continued in fragments, voices lowered but sharp eyes tracking my reactions as if waiting for me to back down and restore the familiar order. I stood there realizing that nothing I said would change how they framed the situation. To them, this was still a family disagreement that could be smoothed over if I stopped insisting on being right. That was when the decision became clear. It wasn't impulsive or fueled by anger. It was the result of understanding that if I treated this as a private matter, it would remain unresolved and repeatable. I stepped away, took out my phone, and called the police. The reaction was immediate. Shock crossed their faces, followed by disbelief, then outrage. I was accused of overreacting, of embarrassing the family, of turning something small into a crisis. Voices rose as they tried to stop me, not by addressing what they had done, but by appealing to guilt and loyalty. I was told this was unnecessary, that we could handle it ourselves, that involving authorities would only make things worse. When that didn't work, the tone shifted. They became victims in their own story, painting themselves as parents who had made an honest mistake and a daughter who had chosen punishment over understanding. By the time the police arrived, the narrative was already being rewritten. I didn't argue or interrupt. I explained the situation calmly, answered questions directly, and let the facts stand on their own. The officers approached it methodically, asking who owned the property, who had permission to be there, and what had occurred. The shift in power was subtle, but undeniable. What had been dismissed moments earlier as a family matter was now a documented incident. My parents bristled at the formality, clearly uncomfortable with the loss of control. They attempted to downplay events, emphasizing intentions over actions, but intention wasn't what the process measured. The presence of law enforcement changed the conversation entirely. Boundaries that had been ignored were now formalized. Access that had been assumed was questioned. The cabin was no longer a shared concept open to interpretation. It was a property with an owner, and that distinction mattered. Watching this unfold, I felt something settle inside me. Not relief exactly, but clarity. The dynamic had shifted in a way it never had before. The argument was no longer about feelings or family expectations. It was about responsibility and consequences. My family's anger intensified as they realized they couldn't talk their way out of this. They cycled through frustration, disbelief, and wounded pride, each reaction reinforcing why this step had been necessary. The officers finished their assessment, outlined next steps, and made it clear that this situation was no longer informal. As they spoke, the illusion that this could be brushed aside finally collapsed. What stood in its place was a clear line that couldn't be argued away or softened with familiar phrases. Calling the police didn't end the conflict, but it changed its nature. It moved the situation out of a space where I was expected to absorb the damage and into one where accountability existed. That moment wasn't the climax of the story, it was the pivot. From that point on, nothing would return to how it had been, and for the first time that reality didn't feel like a loss. A few weeks passed and the shock wore off, replaced by paperwork and consequences. The legal side arrived quietly, not with sirens or arguments, but with forms, notices, and clear timelines. There were reports to review, statements to confirm, and documentation that fixed the events into an official record. Responsibility was assigned in practical terms, including costs tied to damage and remediation, and the process moved forward without emotion. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real, and it demanded attention in ways family conversations never had. Financial obligations followed not as punishment, but as accountability, and they changed the tone of every interaction that remained. At the same time, the social fallout spread faster than anything official. My family began telling their version of the story to anyone who would listen, shaping it to protect themselves and preserve their image. In that version, I wasn't a homeowner defending boundaries. I was an ungrateful daughter who had turned on her own parents. The language was careful and selective, emphasizing intentions and minimizing actions, framing the situation as a misunderstanding, escalated by my refusal to let things go. That label traveled quickly. Relatives stopped reaching out or did so cautiously. Conversations stiff and brief, as if they were afraid of being pulled into something they didn't want to understand. I didn't correct the narrative publicly. I didn't post explanations or argue my case in group chats or online spaces. Silence wasn't agreement. It was a choice to stop performing for people who had already decided who I was. That decision came with a cost. Invitations disappeared, holidays became complicated, and familiar connections weakened until they felt fragile or conditional. The rift in my family wasn't loud, but it was permanent. There were no more casual check-ins or shared plans, only distance and unresolved resentment that no one tried to hide anymore. The pressure built quietly. I felt it in the way my phone stayed silent for days, then filled with messages that carried obligation instead of care. I felt it in the second-guessing late at night, replaying conversations, and wondering how many versions of me were circulating without my consent. Stress showed up physically in interrupted sleep, and constant tension, and emotionally in the steady awareness that I was being judged without a chance to respond. What surprised me was how uneven the burden felt. I carried the weight of being labeled disloyal, while those who crossed the line framed themselves as wounded. Accountability didn't soften their stance, it hardened it. They leaned into the idea that I had chosen rules over relationships even as they avoided acknowledging why rules became necessary in the first place. The family dynamic didn't fracture evenly. It pulled apart along familiar fault lines, leaving me isolated in ways that were both painful and clarifying. Over time, the noise faded. The paperwork concluded its initial stages, obligations were defined, and the constant urgency settled into a dull, ongoing reality. What remained was the emotional aftermath, heavier than anything written down. The loss wasn't just access or approval, it was the illusion that things could return to how they were if I tried harder. Accepting that truth required more energy than the confrontation itself. Living with the consequences meant understanding that protecting myself would continue to be misunderstood and choosing to endure that misunderstanding rather than surrendering my boundaries again. When the last forms were signed and the timelines closed, the noise finally stopped. I didn't wait for another argument or a final apology that would never come. I made the decision myself. I cut contact in clear, practical ways, changed numbers, stopped responding, and put written boundaries in place that didn't leave room for negotiation. There were no dramatic announcements or ultimatums, just a firm withdrawal from a dynamic that had proven it couldn't respect limits. The boundary wasn't emotional, it was operational. From that point on, access ended where my consent ended. My family reacted the way they always had when control slipped away. Some tried to reach out through indirect channels, others went quiet, and a few pushed back, with familiar accusations framing distance as cruelty. What changed was that none of it altered my position. The consequences they faced were no longer abstract. Financial obligations didn't disappear with time, and the loss of easy support forced adjustments they had avoided for years. Plans were scaled back, assumptions reworked, and the comfort of relying on someone else's tolerance was gone. There was no satisfaction in watching that unfold, only a sober understanding that actions carry weight when boundaries are enforced. While they dealt with that reality, I focused on restoring the cabin to what it was meant to be. Repairs were handled methodically, damage addressed without embellishment, and the space gradually returned to a state that felt settled again. The cabin wasn't a symbol of conflict anymore. It became what it had always been intended to be, a place of rest, ownership, and control that didn't require explanation. Each finished repair reinforced the same truth. This space existed because I chose it, maintained it, and protected it. Living there again felt different, not triumphant, but steady. The quiet wasn't empty. It was earned. Without constant messages or pressure to justify myself, my days slowed down. Mornings passed without tension. Evenings ended without rehearsing conversations that never resolved anything. The absence of chaos made room for clarity. I understood what had been lost and what remained. The relationship I stepped away from wasn't one built on mutual respect, and preserving it would have required sacrificing myself in ways I was no longer willing to do. What stayed with me was simpler and more durable. Ownership means responsibility, but it also means authority over your own life. Boundaries aren't punishments, they're conditions for participation. When people ignore them, the cost isn't just damage to property, it's the trust that makes connection possible. That cost doesn't vanish because the people involved share a last name. The story didn't end with reconciliation or restored harmony. It ended with alignment. My values matched my actions, and the space around me reflected that balance. The cabin stood intact again, not as a shared resource or a bargaining chip, but as proof that limits matter. The quiet that followed wasn't an absence of family. It was the presence of peace. And the price of disregarding boundaries was no longer theoretical. It was paid, recorded, and understood, even if it was never acknowledged aloud.